Welcome to part 3 of my presentation on the spatial relationships of the art elements and concepts of space. So, thinking back to Jean Lowe's Overstock, I hope I've demonstrated that there is a connection between an artist's use of space and the meaning that their artwork conveys. Different concepts of space and art provide different means, different ways, different avenues of organizing your ideas and your expressive means. So space is a way of organizing your ideas, your expressive means. It's a way of organizing the conceptual, the material, and the formal elements of your artwork. I'd like to turn to the image on the screen right now by Edward Manet, and I want you to ask yourself, what is strange about this painting? It might help to understand what is unusual about the Edward Manet painting on the left by comparing it to another painting. In this case, I'm comparing it to Caravaggio's Calling of St. Matthew, which is shown on the right and was painted a couple of hundred years earlier. Here's a clue. Pay attention to the lighting. Notice in the Caravaggio, the lighting is very consistent. The light comes in from the side, which is a technique traditionally preferred by oil painters because it allowed them to convey the illusion of realism, to show off their finesse in painting convincing rounded forms. Notice also in the Caravaggio, Christ is in darkness as he's pointing towards Matthew. Matthew and the group of men around him are illuminated. Notice also that the men are in what for Caravaggio would have been contemporary dress instead of trying to show these figures in clothing from another era. They're shown in contemporary fashions of the time. As a final note, while looking at the Caravaggio, notice Christ's hand and think back to Michelangelo's creation of Adam. That hand is a quote from the Sistine Chapel. So the lighting in the Caravaggio is coming from the side to show the rounded forms. The lighting is consistent. Now, look over at Manet's painting on the left-hand side. This is Manet's Dead Christ, and it might help if I illustrate what's happening with the light on both paintings so you can kind of get a handle on what is strange about the Manet on the left-hand side. So while the painting by Caravaggio has a consistent light source with the light in the space falling consistently in all of the figures, on the left-hand side we have an unusual space. The light is doing something strange. It's strange because the two angels in the background seem to be lit from the side, though at slightly different angles perhaps. Yet the body of Christ is lit frontally, almost like there's a flash going off in front of the body. Furthermore, Christ's face is in shadow, which doesn't seem to make sense with the way the light is falling on the rest of his body. So there's an inconsistency in the space in terms of how the light is falling on the different figures. Now, when you light something from the front, as is happening with the body of Christ in Manet's work, it tends to flatten forms. You don't get as much roundedness, a sense of volume as you would if you're lighting it from the side. And we can feel the space around the body of Christ as if it's very condensed, very flat, very thin or shallow, whereas the space around the angels seems to expand. You might ask yourself, was this a mistake on Manet's part? No. I mean, he was a master painter. He knew what he was doing. And we see that in a number of his masterworks, there are different kinds of spatial and lighting inconsistencies. And we think that it was probably done on purpose. So 30 years before these paintings, photography was invented in 1826. And Manet was aware of photographs. In fact, for the first time, artists were able to take pictures of real things, landscapes and people, and put them side by side with images of old master paintings. And one of the things that was surprising to them was that while for hundreds of years old master paintings had framed how we viewed nature, framed how we viewed reality, when they were compared with a photograph, we discovered that the old masters exaggerated, they distorted. The paintings weren't as real as we thought that they might be. Artists would get together and compare photographs of old masterworks with photographs of nature. And while some artists thought that it was their job to improve on what they saw as the flaws, quote unquote, of the natural world, could it be that Manet is taking advantage of this new insight, this new vision that photography was allowing people and artists to have, and playing around with that idea, playing around with ways of manipulating the eye into believing that what is being presented is real, even though there is evidence in the painting that it's not, that it's artificial. With all of this in mind, here is Manet's very famous masterwork, Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe, Luncheon on the Grass. Like you did with the last one, I want you to ask yourself, what is strange about this painting? Of course, one of the first things you might notice is that there is a unclothed lady sitting on the grass with two men in what would have been contemporary clothing for the time. Based on the last example, you might also notice that the lady has very frontal lighting on her, which, as I mentioned, tends to flatten volumes and forms. You might also notice that there is a lady bathing in the background in what looks like a shift or a very thin dress. And then you might notice that she looks really big. If she were to stand up, she would be a giantess. And that feeling of her being really oversized would get even more if she were to walk forward and stand by the three people in the foreground. She would be so out of proportion with them. And then as you look around the painting, you might realize that we have a horizon line in the background with what looks like a vanishing point. This is immediately above the oversized lady, the giant lady. But then you might also notice that there is a path on the left-hand side of the painting that seems to lead back. And it's really curious. While the horizon seems to be obscured in the background, we can tell where the horizon is. We can see a little bit of blue coming through the trees. And then we notice that the two horizons don't line up. There are two different horizon lines and two different vanishing points in this painting. So once again, Manet is playing around with technical inconsistencies, but trying to do it in a way that fools the eye into thinking that this is a realistic painting. In other words, he's playing around with the concept of space, and on the one hand, he's taking what our expectations of a realistic space should be and purposefully undermining those expectations by giving us a space that somewhat looks consistent but really isn't. Let me illustrate what I mean. First, let's divide the painting in a way so that you can see the two different horizon lines and the two different vanishing points that Manet has incorporated into this image. And here I've added some sight lines going back to the two different horizon lines. And then on the right-hand side, I've also added some sight lines that demonstrate where the vanishing point is on the right-hand side. So here we have a master artist who knows all of the tricks of the trade, presenting us with an artwork that seems to flaunt those tricks. So that's a point we'll come back to in a little bit. Before we do that, I'd like to point out a couple more things. The work is full of various kinds of codes, visual codes that we can interpret and talk about and discuss, maybe sometimes have differing opinions on. It also refers to different strategies of representation, different genres in painting. For instance, in the lower left quadrant, we see a basket with some fruit, kind of referring to the tradition of still life painting. As far as visual codes go, if you look in the center of the painting at the very top, we see a bird in mid-flight. If you look at the very, very bottom left-hand corner, stuck way in the corner, there's a small frog. Each one we could talk about and wonder about what that element, what that part means in this painting. So while there's a lot to talk about in this image, I'm going to focus on a couple things. First of all, notice the model in the front. She's one of Manet's favorite models. Her name was Victorine Meurent. And she went on to become a pretty good artist in her own right, exhibiting at the French salon, the Parisian salon, later in life. She was in her teens when she modeled for this picture. Notice the expression on her face. She's looking straight out at the viewer. She is a nude, a female nude, who is confronting the viewer head on, looking straight at us. This is kind of unusual. Typically, when a viewer of the time would be presented with a female nude, she might be in a reclining position or displayed for the delectation of presumably male viewers and not be looking directly at the viewer. We can get a better sense of how unusual it is for Victorine the model to be staring right out at the viewer by comparing it to this other painting, The Birth of Venus by Alexandre Canabel. You can see that the woman is languidly reclining, not looking directly at us, and is there to be visually enjoyed.